We're joined right now by Richard Perle, Resident Fellow for the American Enterprise Institute for Public Policy Research, former Assistant Secretary of Defense, of course, and also part of the movie The Third Jihad, which you could watch and learn about the radicalization in Islam by going to the website, which is thirdjihad.org. And Mr. Perle, welcome back to the show, sir.
Thank you. Pleasure to be with you.
All right, you heard the cut, I presume, that we played of the president just now coming in, and he talked about how we've had deranged people in this country commit acts of terror, and he specifically mentions the shooting at the Sikh temple. He mentions the man who flew the plane into the IRS building, or the IRS the floor where they were located in a building in Texas, and of course Oklahoma City, Timothy McVeigh, without mentioning him by name. And in the so that to me is one issue. Same breath almost, he talks about how it becomes more complicated when jihad's involved. So he did acknowledge jihad, and then he goes to Fort Hood and says that that's apparently what happened there. Yet the folks that incident was classified as a place of workplace violence. So he's all over the place with that. Just that little 30-second bite. What do you make of it all?
Well, I think there's a great deal of confusion. You're quite right. And in failing to recognize, which I think it's important we do, that unlike these other incidents, isolated, non-ideological, if you will, there is a sustained ideology behind Islamist jihad. And until we recognize that, we're not going to find approaches to dealing effectively with it. There's no question that the Hassan shooting was motivated by convictions, ideological convictions that were cultivated over a period of time. And so many of the other acts of violence that we've seen share that characteristic. It's time to face that reality.
It may be time to face the reality, absolutely, but do you, based on what the president had to say today, that the war must end? It's what our democracy demands. How we have to look to other nations where the radicalization takes place over there and look at the causes, and he called it poverty and lack of entrepreneurism, and we have to fix that, and lack of education. Again, the same old tired interpretation, misunderstanding, only I don't think he misunderstands it, but he presents himself as misunderstanding, or maybe a better word is ignoring the realities of why these people who do become radicalized.
Well, poverty, of course, doesn't hold up, because most of the acts that we're concerned about came not from people who were impoverished, but indeed were anything but impoverished. A colonel in the U.S. Army is hardly impoverished, nor does poverty seem to be an inspiration for jihad. The 9/11 hijackers included people from the middle class. The famous beheading of a Wall Street Journal reporter, Daniel Perle, middle class. It's a mistake to think that poverty is the source of this. It's an ideology, and people are recruited into the ideology, often over a long period of time. So we've got to recognize that, because until we recognize it, as I say, we won't develop successful ways of combating it.
I do want to get back to what you just said and talk about the London attacks as well, and the beheading there as well. But I do want to, in your former capacity, certainly as Assistant Secretary of Defense, the President spent, it was the end of the speech, he kind of built up to it as a crescendo and finished with closing Gitmo, and that prompted a heckler who was actually a heckler from the left, saying he didn't do it fast enough or good or well enough. Closing Guantanamo Bay, transferring some of the prisoners to Yemen, which is hardly any kind of government that we could count on keeping those prisoners locked up in, at least in my view. What's your take on the whole Gitmo controversy?
Well, it's such a marginal issue with respect to the threat that we're facing from radical jihad. Whether it's open or closed is, for everyone except Obama and the people that he promised he was going to close it, a relatively small issue. The reason why it's still open is that nobody has been able to figure out what to do with these people. and nobody wants to be responsible for returning them into a situation where they can again take up arms against the United States. There's a real issue there and a real dilemma. And Obama discovered that after becoming president. But to think that at this stage this is the fundamental issue is just nonsense. He's talking to a constituency, not to the country, and he's addressing the problems of a constituency and not the problems of the country. You
don't buy into this, that Gitmo is a symbol, that is a recruiting tool for terrorists around the world? You don't buy that, do you?
Haven't seen any evidence of it. People say it from time to time. There may have been an element of truth in the idea that Abu Ghraib was a tool for recruitment because it was so shocking. But Gitmo, I do not believe there is any evidence to show has increased the number of terrorists. What it has done is it's enabled us to keep some terrorists from being returned to situations where they might well again take up arms.
We're talking to Richard Perle, former Assistant Secretary of Defense and now a resident fellow for the American Enterprise Institute, also part of a very informative movie that I urge everyone to check out, the Third Jihad, which you could check out at the website, thirdjihad.org. Your take on yesterday's terror attack in London? These are two terrorists who were under surveillance, or at least on the radar for the British authorities. And, what we saw was kind of unprecedented. If you do harken back to Daniel Perle, of course, that was recorded for Internet use. But this terrorist, after he beheaded the soldier, took to the cameras and talked and gave a message. He had the bloody hands. He had the axe. The whole thing is kind of unprecedented in the aftermath of a terrorist attack. Talk about the significance of what happened yesterday.
Well, I think the British have a particular problem, which is a very large Anglo-Pakistani population, elements of which have been radicalized. Not all. I mean, one always has to say that the numbers of people who have chosen this course is small, but enough to do a great deal of damage. And the man who murdered Daniel Perle was from that Anglo-Pakistani community, an affluent family, as it happens, and he was recruited into the way of jihad, as this young killer evidently was yesterday. For some reason, the British have been very slow to clamp down on the mosques where jihad and violent jihad is routinely preached. And other countries complain bitterly about it. The French, for example, complain that the Brits allow this sermonizing that then produces radicalization that has to be dealt with in other countries, not just in the United Kingdom. So it's high time that they, again, face the fact that there is a system of recruitment into acts of violence in the name of a radical Islamist vision or ideology, and pretending that isn't there is not the way to deal with it.
And, of course, we found out recently the FBI had to shoot a suspect in the triple murder along with the two Boston bombing brothers. Supposedly he admitted before he was killed that he and the two brothers did the triple homicide a couple of years ago on a 9/11 anniversary. And, again, there it was made to look like a robbery. It wasn't. We don't know exactly what the motivation was, but we can guess because the throats were slit from end to end in an attempt to, to kind of sever the heads there, too.
Yes. Well, that is the prescribed method of murder, according to some extremist cliques. Look, we will not come to grips with this until we face it. And there is such a reluctance to face it because it is feared, I think wrongly, that it is somehow an indictment of the millions of Muslims who have not been persuaded to join this path. This battle has to be fought out within the Muslim community, and what's missing here, I'm sorry to say, is American Muslims taking up arms against the extremists. There are too many Muslim organizations that are inclined to defend the extremists or accuse people who are prepared to talk about them as Islamophobic. And that has to change. The American Muslim community, which is predominantly, overwhelmingly decent and well integrated into this country, needs to stand up and oppose those within their midst who are committing these acts and propagating this radical vision.
Richard Perle, thank you so much, sir. I look forward to talking to you again.
All the best.
Appreciate it. Richard Perle, former Assistant Secretary of Defense, resident fellow, American Enterprise Institute, and check out the movie The Third Jihad at at thirdjihad.org. thirdjihad.org.